In this video, I will talk about modern philosophers, the diary of Anne Frank, and my first ever Stephen King novel, so stay tuned. Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If it's your first time here, my name is Nicholas and my goal for this year was to read 100 books. In this series of videos, I want to give a brief summary and overview over each and every one of them, as well as give my own personal opinion and rating in the end. So, without further ado, let's continue this series with book number 11. The Almanack of Naval Ravikant by Jorgenson. Naval Ravikant is somewhat of a modern philosopher and guru for entrepreneurs. He rose to fame in recent years due to being a successful angel investor and became even more mainstream after several appearances on Joe Rogan's and Tim Ferriss's podcasts. He frequently shares his wisdom on Twitter and is overall very well read and outspoken of his ideas. He had some, for my taste, too unbalanced opinions on COVID within the last 2 years, but this hot issue aside, he is still someone I listen to closely whenever he's on a podcast or gives an interview. The author of this book then, Jorgenson, combed through the internet to thoroughly search for every nugget of wisdom that Naval has shed over the years. He wanted to curate an ultimate best-of album of Naval's tweets, interviews and ideas. In my mind, this is an absolute fantastic and quick read, full of spot-on takeaways about the bigger workings of life. Rarely did I highlight so much in the book as with this almanac. For anyone who has some sort of entrepreneurial mind, this is a full 5 stars. What I like about it is that Naval is capable of breaking down complex workings into simple phrases that always get to the core of the issue and are in no way sugar-coated. For some people, this might then come off as a bit bro-sciencey, as in they might feel like Naval's ideas lack the depth or applicability and are just a lot of hot air. Overall though, this is a great collection of takeaways for entrepreneurs, investors, freelancers and people who have just a general deep interest in life. The best part, this is a free ebook that works on a donation basis. So I've put a link in the description below and I would highly encourage you to check it out. Von der Pflicht by Richard David Precht. Being a philosopher is hard these days. Bygone are the times where philosophers were treated like superstars and filled up whole amphitheaters like in old Greece. Enter Richard David Precht, Germany's most well-known philosopher, who you might have heard of as his book Who Am I and How Many even received an English publication. Back home, he has a weekly podcast, frequently sheds his wisdom in talk shows and shares his opinion, whether asked or not, all too often about artificial intelligence and climate change. He's as famous there as a modern philosopher can get, so I wanted to see what the man writes about and picked up this fairly new book of his. As it unfortunately is not yet available in English, I will loosely translate the title to About Responsibility. In this book then, he shares his thoughts about our obligations and responsibilities as humans, living in a modern democratic state. He argues that we would become a better society if we would have a stronger sense of belonging and being heard within the society. In order to achieve this, he proposes people should do 2 social years, one after high school and one before they retire, in which they would work in elderly homes, help out at hospitals and look after children. The idea is that everyone would therefore feel more as a part of a greater whole, less isolated, and in turn shape a society that's founded on togetherness rather than social fragmentation and in the worst case, fostering of extreme political views. I give this book 3.5 stars, as he argues in a comprehensible and compelling way, but ultimately philosophical texts are exciting only to a certain degree, at least that's the case for me. It was a good exercise for my brain and I loved entertaining the idea in my head, but novels and other less philosophical non-fiction books are probably more up my alley. The Pearl by John Steinbeck. Coming back to good old John Steinbeck. Have a look at my first video of book reviews to hear my thoughts on 2 of his other novels, Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday. If this is your first time hearing his name, he is one of the big American novelists of the past century and even won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1962. He's the author I read the most books of, so you will see him frequently on this list. The Pearl is a short book that tells the story of a fisherman who finds a rare and seemingly pricey pearl. Of course, as these kind of stories go, he is not the only one interested in the object, so he has to learn to differentiate between friend and foe, as well as keep his family safe along the way. This book gets 3 stars from me, as it is an easy read, but the main plot has been done many times before and after. I like Steinbeck a lot for his clear prose, and as with all his other books, he is excellent at making his characters come alive. The overall setting is also fairly unusual for him, as this is one of the few novels not taking place in the Salinas Valley or California as a whole, so it might be worth a try for you even if you've read some of his other books before. The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. To this day, it's not fully clear who betrayed Anne Frank and her family to the Nazis. A recently published book on that matter got heavily criticized for making bold accusations with little proof, and the publisher even had to put out a public apology for it in the end. After the war ended, her father, who was the only survivor of the Frank family, decided nevertheless to publish the diary of his daughter, and it became one of the most important and well-known documentations of Jewish suppression under Nazi rulership. I felt a bit strange going into this, as I felt like, well, reading someone else's diary without their permission, which literally it was. Anne Frank even gives her diary a name, Kitty, that she addresses directly in every entry. Kitty becomes somewhat of a best friend for Anne, that she tells her innermost feelings and secrets to, from the weeks before they had to flee into hiding up to the last day before her capture by the Nazis. What surprised me most is how intelligent, eloquent and strong-willed Anne Frank was for her age, especially if I think back about myself at age 14, and how modern her thoughts and feelings still feel to this day. Sometimes you couldn't tell when the book was written, as unfulfilled love and teenage angst are as common today amongst young adults as they were back then. That also means that you have to set your expectations right. This is not your usual Third Reich memoir about the Holocaust, the big battles or Hitler's life. It involuntarily takes part in this world. You see the outlines of the times everywhere. But it's first and foremost a teenager's diary. Overall, this book was hard to put a rating on, as the author never intended for her words and thoughts to be published. For the sake of better placement in comparison to all the other books in this video series, I will still give the Diary of Anne Frank a 4 out of 5. Now, this is not a rational number coming from me as a critic, but rather how I personally felt about it after having finished it now. Overall, this book gives us a deep insight into the thoughts and feelings of a brave, intelligent and eloquent young girl. It's a teenager's diary, first and foremost, but thereby sheds light on usually less discussed topics and themes of this time period. Misery by Stephen King. Believe it or not, but this is my first contact with Stephen King. Neither did I watch any of the movie adaptations of one of his books, nor did I read any of his novels. The 1987 published book Misery always came out fairly on top when doing some research on which of his books one should read first, and without having any comparisons to his other works just yet, I'm very happy where I started. You follow Paul, a novelist, as he wakes up in an unknown house after having survived a car crash. As it turns out, he got rescued by Annie, his biggest fan. It seems like an act of kindness at first, but Paul quickly realizes that he's not allowed to leave until he writes another book in his famous Misery book series. The problem is that he let the main character, Misery, die in his last novel, and Annie makes it very clear that there's no way out for him until he makes Misery come alive again, just for her. This book was a contender for the full 5 stars at some point, but I will rate it with 4.5 instead. It's a gripping story from start to finish. Annie is written really well, and I had a hard time reading her as a person or anticipating what her next moves might be, same as Paul does. It has some great plot twists, and Stephen King knows exactly when to crank up the speed of the story and when to let it go again. I have to take half a star off though, as there are some extras of the actual Misery book that Paul is writing within the story scattered about this novel. This might sound like a great idea on paper, but these parts were a real slog to read through and didn't add all that much to the overall story itself. They even felt out of place. If it was me, I would just skim over these parts. You're not missing out on anything of the main plot. That being said, Misery is a really great horror thriller and hopefully just my kickoff to more Stephen King. So these were another 5 out of 100 books for this year. If you enjoyed this content, please leave me a like. And if you fancy buying any of these books now, like Stephen King's Misery, please check out the links in my description below. These are so-called affiliate links, so I get a small kickback whenever you purchase a book through these links. Thank you and see you next time. Ciao.